Okay, good morning, everyone. We're here on May 20th. Right now we have 5 people here, and we have some good discussion topics. Um, should be an interesting morning. I don't know how far we're going to get, but we'll do what we can. Charles, who is Charles? We get a video, we might know who Charles is. No video, Charles.
We can work on that.
Oh, okay.
Well, okay. We got more work to do too, I think. Here we go.
There we are. Okay. Very good. Well, we got a couple of new people today. Good, 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 good. Anyway, our first topic, and if you've been watching the news the past couple of weeks, you can't miss it. Has to do with the Marine that put the other gentleman into a chokehold, and ultimately that person died from the chokehold. Um, and I don't know how many of you have watched the video. Uh, and from my personal perspective, and I know this from dealing previously with issues like this, and even with law enforcement, that the media may not be showing us the entire video, so we don't know the entirety of what happened, other than ultimately the young man met his end. Um, so I guess the question is, um, because it depends on a lot of it depends on who your sensei was and what you've been taught, and whether you're a follower of Japanese jiu-jitsu or Brazilian or what have you. Um, the first question is, when can you use certain techniques? When are they justified? And I know that's a question that opens a whole world of possibilities, but I guess a better question is, what are your responsibilities when you're using submissions and holds? Because in some cases you just can't let go. I mean, what do you do? Is anyone kind of
I, if, as a starting point, if we talk about if it's justified or not, I see the whole case as a pure accident because I don't think the kid's intention was to harm the guy. But if you struggle against somebody that cannot choke hold or something like that, then you have to add more power. And I guess that has happened so that he had to add more and more power because the guy is struggling against him. And then it ends bad because he has to wait for a new station to get more help or something like that. So he has, okay, that could have been, he could used other techniques, but also then he had to add the force to keep the guy calm and wait for the next station. But also one point of view is there enough knowledge about these chokeholds because they are just learned without talking about the physical damage they can do. In Jiu-Jitsu, we don't talk so much about the physical damage a chokehold or wrist lock can do. You just learn to react to a situation in probably in a museum state, and you use the technique that is fastest for you. And one of the best techniques to use is, of course, a chokehold to control the head and the whole body, because then if you control the head, you control the whole body. But I see it as a if you talk about justified or not, as a pure accident from this kid, and then unfortunately the outcome was what it was because he probably has to wait for a new station to get more help to keep the guy under control. But I have seen other videos where people who use triangle strokes, and also in same situation where somebody has to step up. There's somebody that's doing something wrong. Somebody has to stop and do something. And I've seen that other people have tried this triangle choke. There have been knees on the neck and because controlling the head is probably the easiest way to control a person.
Okay. Any other?
Sensei, look, I think the questions that you proposed here they can go into a million different directions. I mean, Joni had touched on a couple of directions that I think you had mentioned, but let's start back a little bit. You know, when is a technique or a hold or a restraint or a joint lock, a chokehold or whatever, when is it necessary? When is it applicable to use it in a real life situation? Well, you know, or what techniques do you use in a real life situation? Well, that depends on the scenario, right? If it's not a sporting event, if your life is on the line, then everything is okay. But that's between you and the higher being on, you know, what the outcome of what you're doing to someone else is going to result in. Chokeholds, you know, through my training have been very, very, very strictly oversighted by any individual. In my case, most of the time was either yourself or Sensei Jack Garrett. And they were very, very instructed to me to where describing the results of what a chokehold would do. So let's pause when I talk about that for 1 second. But then you have this mass industry of martial artists that give the impression that a chokehold is okay to use in sporting events. Okay, let's hold on that for a second as well, right? Well, going back to the first part that I was saying, realistically, a chokehold is one of the most humane techniques that you can actually use in an effort to be able to subdue a potential threat, right? And what the misunderstanding is, trying to tie both of those topics together, is there's only a very, very small window that you have. One, we obviously know the outcome. If you continue to hold it, it's terminal. But even before that, you can start to create brain damage. And so if you apply a chokehold correctly, you realistically have about 5 or 7 seconds before that starts to happen. You know, obviously you would render someone unconscious. And then from there, the clock is ticking even quicker before you start to do permanent damage to someone and ultimately terminate somebody. And so I think the education part of it is a big deal. And so what it has impacted in the use for law enforcement, which would be one of the only things, if not the only thing, that would be able to use, that law officials would be able to use in an effort to be able to defend themselves with somebody that's under the influence of any type of a narcotic.
Hey, Darren, just real quick, I want to interrupt you because a lot of law enforcement agencies have outlawed chokeholds, the use of chokeholds, including New York City. It's illegal for a cop, for a sworn police officer to use a chokehold.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm trying to get at. And unfortunately, because that's one of the only holds or only techniques that you can use, and when somebody is under the influence of some sort of narcotic that you can't control. I mean, obviously strength is involved with individuals, but to render them unconscious, to be able, in an effort to be able to put them in an area to where the officer can be safe. It's the most effective and most humane way or technique that you can use to do that if you properly understand the technique. Unfortunately, the education isn't there, and then it appears that it's used to where it's not designed in an effort where people are dying because of it, right? Because of the application of it, because they don't understand what happens with it, what the result of it can be. It's certainly not used, that technique, again, missing the education part of it, it's certainly not used, or should it be used, in an effort to restrain somebody or for compliance. that's not what that technique would be designed to do. You're not really gonna restrain somebody by holding them in a chokehold, because you're still gonna have to fight the struggle the entire time. Understanding how you're gonna apply that technique, because somebody's gonna continue to try to fight you, and then continuing to squeeze or intensify the grip that you have on someone's throat, ultimately ends up in the worst scenario in termination. So that is absolutely. So you have those education parts of, okay, as a law enforcement official, this is probably the most humane technique that I can use in an effort not to hurt someone. But in sporting events, you have it to where it's misunderstood to where, okay, it's used as a submission technique. Well, it's not really a painful thing. There's two differences, right? One, you're cutting off the blood flow to the brain, which nobody really ever feels like that's a threat, right? So nobody gets submitted. You don't feel like that's a threat because you don't understand what the ultimate outcome is going to be. If you cut somebody's wind off, if they can't breathe, then they fight more. So there's a threat there, but that's two different applications of the technique of what's happening. So if you have someone where you're just cutting the blood flow off and they don't fight, but they pass out because of lack of blood flow to the brain, and you hold that technique, we know what the outcome is. As martial artists, experienced martial artists, we know what the outcome is. But the person that you're doing that to in a general scenario or in the streets, they may not understand that that's a threat to them, because they don't feel threatened by not knowing that they're going to pass out. If you apply the choke, you would feel, okay, there's no threat here. If you cut somebody's wind off, it's like they're drowning. They're going to fight you to the death. That's the truth. Like, if you can't breathe, just like if you're drowning, you're going to do whatever it takes to get to the surface so you can breathe again. That's no different than somebody cutting the wind off when you're holding them in that type of a choke. But you're saved in a sporting event by, okay, I can tap. Okay, in the street, there is no tapping because there's two scenarios. One, there's no threat, so the person continues to fight you. Or two, there is a threat, and they continue to fight you because they know that there's a threat there to their well-being. And the misunderstanding is, who's applying the choke? Who's applying the choke? Do you understand what the end result is going to be? And the education part of it, I think, is the biggest deal here. But ultimately, it goes back to, what techniques do you use? Well, that depends on the scenario. Is your life on the line? And how much do you hold it? A chokehold is not used or designed as a compliance technique or a restraint technique. You have to be able to do other things. And in jiu-jitsu, you have to understand how to transition and move on to other things. And the chokehold, unless your life is on the line or unless somebody is under the influence of something, is probably one of the last things that you should use unless you're educated in applying those techniques.
Let me toss a couple thoughts in here edgewise. I don't like the term chokehold because because chokehold infers you're choking off the air supply, whereas in reality, if this essentially what is a carotid press is applied properly, it cuts off the blood supply. It depends how you're.
So I do think in this case, I think they did say it was, I think technically a choke. I think they said it was a throat compression.
Yeah.
I think they mean windpipe.
Yeah.
In this case.
And
because he struggled and, because of the way it got applied, like you're saying.
The other factor, and this is one thing the LAPD found out a long time ago, was because he did not die instantly, or not instantly is a wrong word, but they found that in a number of cases before they made the chokehold illegal, unless it was an absolute necessity in life and death situation, they found a number of people who had had a chokehold applied, once they were put in a jail cell, they would die, and basically the PTSD, and it took them a while to realize that this is what was happening, that the body itself shuts down after the physical emotional shock. And apparently that's what was killing a number of jailed suspects, or whatever you want to call them. And that was a major reason why they stopped doing that. There are a number of other problems with the chokehold, depending on when it's applied and how. But I think in this case, one thing that was brought out a couple of days ago in the news is that the person who was killed had not actually physically attacked the Marine, and he felt threatened, and he felt he had to protect those around him. Now, how well that's going to play out in a court of law is a whole different, we all know, is a whole different ball game. But the issue for me is, was there something, he may not have known whatever else to do. He may not, I'm not excusing what he did, but, the question is, was a chokehold a necessity? Could he have done something else, or should he have done anything at all, being that he was not physically attacked? And that, I'm sure, will come up in the court proceedings. And that's the really sad part about it. Chokehold is a real problem hold. I know I've had to restrain people. There are other ways to do it. Darren mentioned this to some extent, that if you know your air supply is cut off, you're going to fight like hell to get air. But there are.
So I think too, that's what we were talking about too with Ukemi. I think that's one of those problems of Ukemi, is when you put somebody in a hold, there's a response that they have to give you.
Right.
And that's what you train with, is them tapping you immediately. You're never going to see somebody try to gouge your eyes out because they're flailing and they can't breathe and they're tearing flesh off of your arms. And you have no idea that that's coming. You expected him. I bet he expected him to go, okay, you got me.
Yeah,
and,
that's never going to happen on the street.
Right, and that's what I was referring to, Dane. So exactly what you're saying. You have this whole mass industry of competitive combat sports, right? And these kids, like young children, are being taught to apply this technique that could be terminal. And they don't understand that somebody may not tap in the street. In school, when they get into an altercation because somebody's bullying them and they try to protect themselves, and they do what they do in a sport when there's a referee there and other people watching it, and that person doesn't tap because they don't know, they don't participate in that type of event. I think in the future, we may unfortunately start to see more of this.
Yeah, that's something I really dislike about the kind of general philosophy of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is because in real life, if you're in call it a bar fight, and you're having a fist fight, it kind of stays contained to that sort of a level. But as soon as you grab somebody by the waist, drag them to the ground, sit on their chest, and start hitting them in the face, where can that possibly go? If that's your strategy with any fight, you just made it life and death. Now the person that just wanted to take a swing at you is now trying to gouge your eyes out to get you off of them, and you're panicked about their friends, and it changes it immediately. Once somebody takes your waist and brings you to the ground, you panic, and it's a different thing. Now you're doing something else. It's like a nuclear reaction to a skirmish or whatever. It just escalates so quickly,
right? Well,
which is great in a sport. You want to bring him down to the ground immediately so he'll tap. But in a public situation in real life, that's the end of that. You've changed it, and it doesn't go back from there as soon as you take somebody down like that.
The issue, and this is probably coming from my training, and I to me, there are a ton of other pain compliance techniques that could work. Okay. Well, you could even initiate, we say jujitsu is a defensive art, but the reality is you can grab hold of a person and put them in a control hold or whatnot, and then you become the offender, not the defender, because you initiated the physical action. But I personally would not want to go down to the ground, and I would do my best to get out of that situation, because that's the worst place to be. If someone had been sympathetic to this person, I think it would have gone far differently. And that's why, you've got to,
you have to weigh the balance.
Yeah, you have to weigh the balance, but
people would think that they're sympathetic.
A chokehold, in the great scheme of things, 5 to 7 seconds is a long time on the ground. And if it takes you that long, and of course he was, they were struggling a lot longer than 5 or 7 seconds. That's a bad situation for both parties. It just seems, my personal opinion is, I would, even if I was putting on even if I got into a chokehold, I would want to get out of that, applying that as fast as possible, because it's not a good situation for me as a person that's applying the hold. I know what the consequences can be, and I don't think I would take that risk unless my life was in definite danger. Because that you can argue in court. If I had been physically attacked, the person was bigger than me, he's 20 years old, Marine, I'm 80 years old, some frail little old guy. There are, I'm not trying to be humorous here, but there are a lot of things that would be in my favor to use a higher level of force on him than maybe what he had done to me. But because he had threatened me verbally, or I felt scared by him or apprehensive, that does not justify me doing anything physical to him. And that is, that doesn't help the gentleman who was killed. But I think, as Darren said, as Dane has said, there has to be a reality check. People need to know what things they do, what their potential of injury is. And most of the stuff I teach in terms of jiu-jitsu, the person's going to end up, I've never had a person go down to the ground, go down. Look, I've never had a student who's been in a street situation. They've never had to go down to the ground. The person's always been injured, either by the technique itself, which resulted in a fracture. They've also usually sustained a concussion, a couple broken, when they hit the ground, they don't know how to land, so they sustain an additional injury there. But they were physically attacked. And I think the chokehold runs into problems, as Darren said, is because people are not, they think they're in a sport. They think they can maintain this choke or hold, and the person will eventually tap out. And the real world doesn't work that way. And I've told it's a thing I make an issue of in the dojo. On the street, the person's not going to tap out. They're not going to have time to tap out. And because you don't want you want your physical contact with that person to be as brief as possible. And I think, regardless of martial art, yes, we do teach chokehold in class, but the students are aware of what it can do. And that is the key. And that's why, as Ernest has said, and I said, a lot of law enforcement agencies have made that hold illegal unless it's an absolute life and death situation. And that needs to sift its way down to the, whatever martial art is teaching. You have to, when you teach a technique or any type of submission technique or a lock or joint lock or anything, you have to get your students to understand this is going to result in an injury if you do it normal speed, or it's going to and possibly a permanent injury. I had one student decades ago who walked through a dark park at night, which was stupid on his part. And one of his friends decided to jump him from behind, and he threw the guy. Person ended up with permanent brain damage. He still feels bad about that. But for some reason, that was a situation. As martial artists, we have to teach our students what are the consequences of what they do. And it's not to make them feel guilty or hesitant, because there are situations where even the chokehold may be valid, but they need to know that if they do anything correctly, the chances of them injuring the person are extremely high.
So the question goes back to when you're using one of those techniques, when is enough, right? And I think the answer goes back to, well, it depends on the scenario and the individuals that are involved. If you feel like your life is still in danger, then that's something that you're going to have to answer to, whether it's the legal system or a higher authority.
Yes.
In that regard. And I think unfortunately for law enforcement officials that have had that technique banned, it's a disadvantage for them, because, and not that they shouldn't be educated, because they need to be educated about the end result of that technique as well. But, whether it's an in the street altercation between two individuals that are not law enforcement officials, or it's a law official trying to protect themselves or others and having to use that technique. Because if you use any other technique when somebody's under the influence of a narcotic, in most case scenarios, if you do a joint lock or anything else that would have an extreme outcome or an effect, or gives you the ability to use as a compliance or restraint, or hold down somebody to where they're not injured, or manipulate them, that's going to have zero effect on the individual that's under the influence of something. They won't feel that. I mean, even if there's a threat to you're going to break their bones, they wouldn't even care. And even if you did break their bones, they still don't care. Right. And to render them unconscious is the most humane way to do that. And they just need to understand the outcome of what it is, what it's designed, and what would happen with applying those techniques appropriately and effectively when it's necessary.
Right. I've, courtesy of law enforcement agency, I've seen some videos where I think the worst one I've seen was one man who was buck naked. He was shot by police 4 or 5 times in the chest. He was still attacking the police officers until he bled out. Depending, you're right. Depending on what the person is under the influence of is going to determine the effectiveness of what you can do. If you know how to use control holds properly, and I don't consider a choke as a control hold, because a control hold allows you to move the person, or chokehold, you're stuck under them. Now, the other factor is, number one, with pain compliance, you can control the pain, and at some point, even I've dealt with some people who've been under the influence. At some point, They may, if they start to feel the pain, then that's how much you have to use, how much pain you need to create. Sometimes that works, okay? Sometimes it doesn't, and then you have to do something else. I usually tell my students, if you're attacked by someone who's really high on drugs, find a 2x4, find a baseball bat, break one of their legs with it. They won't feel it, but they can't chase you. I mean, that's a sad way of looking at it. There's David Bellman, 10th Dan in Katsugo, just wrote an editorial which will be in a future issue of Kokoro, dealing with knife attacks. He says most people, you know, if someone comes out with a knife, a lot of the techniques that are taught really don't work on the street. And I tell my students, with a knife attack, odds are you're going to get cut anyway, to some extent. And he said one of the best things to do is, if you can find something around you to get in between you and your attacker, a chair, anything, a jacket, whip your belt off and whack him with a belt buckle. Anything you can do to create distance between you is probably the best thing to do. And that has nothing to do with all the jiu-jitsu techniques, you know. It's a matter of survival. Now, fortunately, law enforcement personnel are armed, and there are some states that allow people to carry concealed weapons, you know, but that's something else. But I think the problem with the chokehold, as Darren said, is that no one is dealing with the street reality of it, and that's the unfortunate part. There are alternatives. The FBI, I believe the FBI several years ago came up with an alternate approach to the chokehold, because the chokehold was being used to bring a person down to the ground, to put them in a controlled situation. And in my book, as long as a person's resisting, they're not in a controlled situation.
There's also one thing. I think this leans back to a subject we talked about earlier, because in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the outcome is almost always that you are underground. And the situation the guy was in is that he has a guy on him and he has a chokehold behind him with all the mass on him. The situation is very, very bad as a standpoint for doing anything else or getting up. So I think there's a problem also of this modern Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, how it's taught, because they taught it to end always on the ground, and it's also acceptable to have the mass on you, because the talented guys, they can come out of it. They have their own techniques to get out of it. But if you aren't so talented in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and you can a few tricks, then you will end up under him and you can't get out. Right. So I see the problem. Yeah. You never get underground. The problem is staying up and never get on the ground, because if you're up and you have a chokehold on a guy, then you can do something else. You can take the arm or make a arm block. But when you have the mass on you and you're underground and you are the sufficient Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy, then you are in deep trouble, and it can really lead to this what happened here, because there's no way out.
There are two additional factors here. One, if the chokehold was applied properly by law enforcement, the way it's supposed to work is you bring the person down. We need to get in, because that's another issue. And once he's down in a sitting position, you then roll him onto his stomach and go into a cuffing position. You don't maintain that chokehold. That was never perceived as the final move. The purpose is to get the person cuffed and secure, and then you bring them back up into a sitting position so they can breathe properly, or standing, okay? Whatever you need to do. The other problem with the chokehold and bringing the person down, which they also found, was that unless you support the vertebrae in the upper part of the neck, it can cause a fatal, it can break their neck or cause fatal injury or nerve damage, which will ultimately kill the person, because you're not supporting the vertebrae as you're applying this chokehold. And most people, don't even envision that issue, because they just think, oh, this person's being choked. But there's also a high risk of causing a fatality by unintentionally breaking their neck, for lack of a better term. It's a more accurate medical term. And that's another reason that law enforcement agencies made this an illegal hold. Like I said, the FBI, or I don't know if the FBI, they came up with one, which I've taught, that actually works very well to bring a person down. And rather than doing the chokehold, you basically put your hands over the person's eyes, and your forearms have to rest on their shoulders, and you can bring this person to your chest and take them down that way. There's no chokehold. And it works remarkably well, because with a chokehold, you can still see what's going on. With this, you can't see what's going on, and that's very scary to people. And it's also very disorienting, because they don't know what's happening to themselves physically. But
probably throws off their inner ear too.
Yes.
Like their sense of balance, right?
Balance is off too. It just throws everything off. And it's a very, you're not going to choke the person out. But again, that technique has to be done in a very specific manner to work. It's not as forgiving, bad word, as a chokehold. A chokehold can be done really sloppily and still work. But anyway,
yeah, they like to say that 80% of all fights end up on the ground, or whatever they like to say. And I always like to point out that 100% of them start off standing.
Yes. And like I've said, I'm in all the years, I've only had one person who's had to go down to the ground, and that was a black belt who chased a purse snatcher, and the purse snatcher pulled a knife on him. A screwdriver. And it was a shoulder lock pin, and that's what he ended up with. Darren, you don't have any voice, Darren?
Sorry, thank you, Sensei.
Yeah.
I was agreeing with Dane on his 100% of any altercation start standing up, and also that's a skewed percentage. That what happens is, the reason why that percentage is the way that it's interpreted is because it's a law enforcement stat, and the command is to make people get on the floor, and so they use that in part of an altercation to be able to get that percentage there. But 100%, as you said, yeah,
it was marketing. It was like almost a trademarked like slogan for Gracie. Like it wasn't like yep.
That's just real quick. I just wanted to put something out there, and I agree with Joni that it was an accident. I don't think he had former Marine had any ill intent. He just wanted to control the situation, but he wasn't a trained martial artist. He learned that technique in basic, and basic training is 11 weeks, and then he went on about learning his job in the Marine Corps. So when we talk about it, we talk about somebody. We do martial arts every week, maybe several times a week. And people on the street aren't trained martial artists. And you never know the underlying physical conditions of the person that you're confronting. You don't know if they have a bad heart, they have asthma. You just don't know. So anything that you do to that person, you are legally liable for. And that's the calculus that you have to do on the street on whether or not you engage with someone. You see some of these states like the stand your ground states where people just step on your property, you can shoot them, and you probably could get off, right? Because you feared for your life. But there's other states where you're going to get jammed up, and you're going to have to prepare for paying a lot of money out of pocket. The fortunate thing for the former Marine is that a lot of people are raising money for his legal defense. But look at his life. His life has been turned upside down. And I'm sure if he had a chance to do it all over again, he just would have waited for the police.
Right. Ernest, you made some very valid points.
Yes.
I mean, I agree. You just like there's three different criteria. If you can look at it, what we're talking about sport, we're talking about law enforcement protecting the community, and then you're talking about the military, which typically has to defend their own life, right? That's what they're doing. And those things can ultimately be confused in every one of those scenarios, and those lines are crossed every day. And all of the things that you mentioned about you don't know what, unless you're in a class or you know someone personally, you don't know what other things they have going on with their body, what kind of condition, health wise or whatever. And that's all considerations to what needs to be, what is allowed for somebody to do to something. But in a sporting event, then obviously that person that has some physical limitations wouldn't participate. But in the street, that same person still may get in an altercation, and the individual that they're in an altercation with don't know that that person has these limitations or conditions that could ultimately end into something different. And then the law enforcement official has to deal with the same criteria, right? But he don't understand that. But his job is to protect and serve, right? And so they don't know, and then that lines across there. But the ultimate end is when you get to the military person, typically away from home, if they're in fighting battles, if you will, or not, right? Because they're defending the country, their life is typically on the line. And humanely, yes, there's probably a line, but ultimately, it's either life or death for them. I mean, in most case scenarios. So, like, all of those lines are so blurred by everyone.
And, it kind of raises the point, too. Like, you don't know the problem of using the very least you could think of. Like, instead of a chokehold, if he just grabbed him on the shoulders, like, we don't know their condition and their training and all of that stuff. You also don't know if he's got a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So now you try to do something very delicate and whatever, and all you've done is create an opening to be overcome. You thought, I'm giving this guy a break, and he sees an opening and takes advantage of that. And like we were saying, like everything, there is not a person alive right now who like doesn't know how to do spin kicks and punches and take you down like MMA just from watching TV. People are like decent at karate and boxing just from having grown up seeing it. So nobody's like really untrained when you have this kind of situation happen. You have no idea what kind of response they could give you. You don't know if they're ex-military even. They've learned the same kind of stuff too, and you just don't know. And I think something too, it's really unfortunate that we see like 40 seconds of it, and that's what we have to base everything on in our discussions when it was like a 20-minute ordeal. But the thing to keep in mind with that is the environment is really unique. Like being on the subway specifically, you're like in a submarine. I'm not sure where he was or for how long or what was going on, but when you're underground in a tunnel in a little submarine that you can't get out of, and there's no cell phone service, and you can't do things, there's nobody coming, that train could get stuck in the tracks too. It could just get stuck in a tunnel for an hour, and then there could be track work happening. I don't know what's going on, but that changes that situation a great deal too. The feeling of what's going on when you absolutely cannot escape. That's always your first thing in self-defense, is you do something to get an escape. But it kind of escalates everything immediately when there's nowhere to escape. There absolutely isn't anywhere to go until those doors open somewhere.
And we all understand, Dave, when you say that, when you're using that very scenario, we all understand that 15 seconds is not 15 seconds. It's an eternity.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing that has not been mentioned here at all so far has been the mental condition of the young man, and that bespeaks to at least in my book, a greater societal responsibility, because this problem is not unique to the subway in New York City. Years ago in California, decades ago, we had a governor who, and I won't say which one, who essentially closed all the institution that would house a lot of the people that have serious mental illnesses that are now, homeless. They're in other places, mass shootings, what have you. The mental care has really been, we've kind of relegated it to the trash can. It's an issue we're not willing to face, possibly because it's going to be very expensive to deal with. But some people perhaps really need to be institutionalized, and if they were institutionalized, some of the violence that's occurring today in this country, and I don't know about other countries, might not be happening. And that's an entirely different social issue. But because we aren't dealing with that social issue, we end up with incidents, and I'm not trying to minimize it, incidents where we have a young man who is suffering a mental condition, is confronted by a Marine who feels threatened. I won't say Marine, a person who feels threatened. And so that person takes physical action against a person who is mentally disturbed. And that, his action unfortunately results in that person's death. And again, because they are in a subway, they are in a submarine, they're stuck, they can't escape. That plays into the situation. I have no doubt that his defense attorney will bring up all these arguments to legitimize what he did. But as Darren says, regardless of the court outcome, there's also the, if you believe in a hereafter, there is also the hereafter as to how that will bear out on him, depending on his beliefs as well. So, it's something that people tend to generally ignore because it's something that's, for some reason, we think we can sweep it under the carpet, but we really can't. So I don't know if that larger issue is worth considering, or whether we just deal with, what actually happened. Or am I finding an excuse here, or
I think it's a cautionary tale for other people who see these kind of cases and say, okay, how would I react in a similar situation? And so it's beneficial to publicize it, to keep it out there in the public, and get people thinking, okay, if I come across a crazy person, which is, that's very possible these days, how would I react with that person? Would I just ignore them, try not to engage with them? Or, if they touch me, then I do something else.
Yeah. But, again, the two issues is sometimes, I've had to deal with some weird people. As a teacher, you wonder times, how can this kid be so normal when the parents don't even know where left field is? They're just totally bonkers parents, and you sometimes can find a way to find something to agree with them on, and that then gives you a chance at resolving the situation. Part of it maybe is using verbal judo, as we like to say. Find a way. Agree with the person, calm them down. And that's always the first cause of action. Sometimes it's a matter of just confronting them. Years ago, I was on a picnic with my wife, and I went back to my car to get something, and two men approached me, and one said, "Do you have $5?" Fortunately, I had the car door between me and them. I got behind the car door and I looked at them and I said, "No, I don't." And that ended the confrontation. Because I had the presence of mind to be behind the car door with them on the other side, so they couldn't get to me directly. But that's part of going back to get something in between you and the potential attacker. And it sometimes that's why perhaps there's also been a demand for more mental health workers to go along with the police or instead of the police. Although I don't, there are some real issues there, but even if a person touches you, I mean, I've had adult gang members come up and just push me back. And I'll just go back into ready stance and say, let's hold off here. If you can verbalize, sometimes you can reduce that physical potential for a physical confrontation. Just because someone attacks you or pushes you or something like that, it doesn't mean you have to respond physically. And that's a hard thing for some people to accept, whether or not you're a martial artist.
I think that's the majority, Sensei.
What?
That's the majority of people out there.
They don't. They think if they're pushed, they've got to respond with a physical action. You don't have to. Because, and part of it comes down to, if the other person sees that you can maintain your cool, that's intimidating to them. That puts doubt, that can put doubt in their mind. And part of effectively defending yourself, you got to read Sun Tzu. If you haven't read Sun Tzu, if you put doubt in your enemy's mind, you have won. And it's just, it works. But that's not this situation.
So, in not to make it specific about this, but just as a general kind of concept, just that idea of acting first, let's call it. You're in a situation, there's a threat, you respond before there's a physical altercation. Obviously, you want to avoid that, but are there times where that's not actually acting first, but that is the correct response? So, like, for instance, if somebody's saying, "I'm very mad at you and I might push you," you could de-escalate that and talk. You shouldn't, go crazy. But if somebody says, "I have a gun in my pocket and I'm going to shoot you," should you wait until they draw the gun and shoot you? Right? That's what, again, with the subway in particular, I'd have to look it up. I think relatively recently, within months, I think there was something where there was an altercation on the train. It seemingly was de-escalated, and then when the person got off the train, they got stabbed like 17 times in the kidney in like 1 second. It's not, they didn't pull a knife and threaten them or anything. It was, oh, okay, and then just boom. Like that, like you were saying before, that fantasy of a knife fight. I think a lot of times those techniques are actually like a good excuse for your opponent's hands to be in useful positions for you in training. You know, nobody's going to stab you with a straight stab to your solar plexus. That's just so you have a way to, you know, practice a certain grip. Nobody's going to come at you like this with an ice pick. That's just so you have that guy's hand in this position. You know, a real knife fight, they just go like this really, really fast and you can't do anything. The blade's against you and it's just that, you know. So I don't know what the person was saying and things, but at what point does just talking to somebody make it, you know, I have to believe what they're saying and act first here, you know? I don't know. What is kind of the take on that?
Yeah. I if you can talk a person down, you talk them down. If you feel there is, if you felt there is a real threat like that, you got to have some good witnesses. I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious here, but if other people will justify, it's not that you can justify your actions, other people have to justify your action. And that then becomes the key to your defense. And I'm not an attorney, so don't quote me. But it's if other people can attest to the validity of your thinking, then you have a chance in a court of law. I would if I had a verbal altercation with a person in a crowded environment, I would keep my eye on, and I've done this, I would keep my eye on that person until I was safely out of that environment and away from them.
That's absolute key, Sensei. Like, the threat isn't over till you know that you're in
the threat is not over until you are safely away. And I think the best example I can come up with that was when I was teaching junior high. One of my brown belts I thought he had talked his way out of the fight. If we didn't have one good fight on that campus every week, there was something wrong. And there were a number of teachers around, and his one mistake was he thought he had talked the other kid out of the fight. He turned around to walk away, and the kid tried a roundhouse punch from behind. And fortunately, the brown belt saw it out of the corner of his eye, blocked his arm, actually broke his arm with the block, and that ended the fight. I mean, that really upset a lot of people. And it even upset the kid that blocked. The other kid, paramedics took him away. They, got suspended for fighting. And there were enough teachers that stood up for this one kid and said, he didn't fight. All he did was block a hit. He stayed in school. A lot of it comes down to the individual situation. But as Darren said, I would keep, you are not in a safe situation until you are in a safe situation, safe environment. And if that means you get off the subway one stop earlier, then you get off the subway one stop earlier. Or if you see the person getting off, you take the next stop. I mean, it's all of these are judgment calls. But the ideal in life is to always make good judgments. We don't all the time, but that's the goal in life.
Seek perfection. Pardon? You never reach it. You seek perfection. You never reach it.
Perfection, right? You never reach it. But anyway, what else do we have on this topic? Question, because it's let's see what time we have. An hour on this one already.
And your voice may be used for verification.
Who said that?
Robert.
We needed that little bit of humor. Anyway, thank you, Robert.
Don't we all love just talking to computers? It's so
right.
wonderful.
Okay. There is because another issue is what's reasonable force and what's excessive force. Most law enforcement agencies today have what's known as a use of force continuum. And when an officer goes through training, there are certain things, they can't go, well, the suspect looks hostile, so I'm going to shoot him. You can't, there has to be a certain, officers can only do certain things at certain stages. They have to ideally move up their use of continuum from like verbal commands to restraining, physically restraining, to use of non-lethal weapons, use of lethal weapons. There is a sequence, ideally, which they should be following. If, for lack of a better phrase, the flak hits the fan, they can jump, but they have to be able to justify it when push comes to shove. And that today is very critical for law enforcement agencies to have that, because otherwise a good attorney will literally rake the governing agencies over the hot coals. And it's something, for example, from the Rodney King incident, one of the things when the Civilian Martial Arts Advisory Panel was formed, one of the things we changed was, prior to that time, the police were required to use side handle batons, PR-24, before they could use pepper spray. And the first recommendation we made was, you need to switch that, because pepper spray is potentially will do less damage to the perpetrator than hitting him with a baton. And that has become, a lot of agencies have picked up on that policy now. But you have to look at what is, even as martial artists, what is the difference between reasonable force, excessive force, and do we have, or should we be following a use of force continuum, or do we have to as civilians? Or have I asked?
Definitely have to, right? I think you definitely have to. As a civilian, you still have to. Like you were saying, like if somebody grabs your shoulder, you can't just gouge their eyes out. That's not an appropriate response. If somebody grabs your shoulder, you could shove them. If somebody shoves you, you could shove them back or whatever, right? I think so we do have that. You can't break somebody's leg because they grabbed your shirt like this, despite what karate self-defense shows you when you're a white belt. But you do have that same thing. If you're carrying a gun, you can't just shoot somebody because you're scared. The same kind of things apply.
Except for stand your ground country states.
Right.
Some of them.
Right. Well, at that point, though, they've posed a threat. You can't just go outside your property and go get them, right? They've still, it's funny how much effort we are taking to consider our responses to things. There should be a dialogue amongst criminals to consider their actions amongst us.
They do.
Right?
That's why you have, I learned this back in the 80s when I was working in the state of Nevada. The first time I heard the term University of California at San Quentin,
right,
it kind of took me aback until I connected the dots, because it's amazing what people in prison learn about improving their antisocial skills, which are necessary for their social survival in jail. And I'm not trying to approach this humorously, because it does have serious implications for law enforcement and law-abiding citizens. But there is, and in California, sometimes we jokingly say, although it's true, you don't want to, if someone breaks into your house, make sure you don't shoot them in the back. Because they're leaving. They're not posing a physical threat to you any longer. But in other states, if they step onto your property, theoretically you're entitled to shoot them. There's no standard.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, and Dane, you're correct in that, you physically as a martial artist, we have a responsibility to respond only
in kind, right?
In kind, appropriate to the attack. And that's, I think in any martial art, that's very hard until you've been a black belt for X number of years and you have enough of a background and experience and control holds and all that other stuff. It's only then that you are in a position where you can make a judge, I think, for many times, where you can make a judgment call as to what you're going to do ultimately to this person who has attacked you. Because students who don't have the experience, they only have a very limited range of things they can do. That's why Seki wouldn't take students under the age of 10. Because number one, age 10, you get your large muscles under control. And number two, under 10, most kids don't realize they really hurt someone. And it's when you realize you can hurt someone or if you've actually injured a person, that's when you realize what your potential is. And that causes you to take a step back. Every student I've had that has been in a street situation, and in every case, their attacker has been injured, they initially feel very bad about actually injuring that person. And it takes me, I make it as part of my responsibility as their sensei to debrief them as necessary and kind of monitor how you're doing. Is there anything that, is still upsetting about this? Do you want to talk to the class about it? Which is a very valuable thing for them to do. You need to kind of do, it's basically a PTSD situation. You need to have them feel secure about what they did as being okay, and there's nothing wrong with them. And it's okay to feel the way they felt. Because, I'm going to use a phrase to that one mother that I knew the whole family there. They were all the kids are all in the martial arts. Her famous phrase when something went south was "shit happens." And it was you no matter how upset you were with what happened, you just think that phrase and it brings a smile to your face because it happens, and all you can do is move on. But anyway, so we I guess the question still remains, how do we get our students to develop this skill? Or is it something we just have to wait until they get good enough at their martial art to the point where they develop good judgment as to what to use and what not to use?
Then disadvantage, Sensei. Then you have a part of the community that takes martial arts and understands it, and the other part that don't. And as Dane had mentioned in quite a few scenarios, one tries to not apply a technique in an effort to have a humane impact, and the other one takes advantage of it. I guess short of the government coming in and saying, because they do everything else these days, and saying that everybody out there in the US is now mandated to take a martial art until they reach a certain experience level, we'll always have that.
Then all of us would be millionaires. Anyway, okay. let's move on here. I think we've dealt with the use of force. The only other issue, and if we want to get into it, is do we want to get into the issue of reasonable force versus stand your ground? Do we want to try and define those, or is there anyone here who lives in a stand your ground state? Okay, that solves that problem. But okay. Let's move on here, because this is somewhat related as well. We're talking about martial arts techniques, topic number 3. Have you had to withhold a technique that you consider dangerous from certain students unless they are a certain rank, age, or maturity? Or another one is, which techniques do you consider to be too dangerous to teach to the general to the general public or students?
Well, you can't teach it to us now.
You can't what?
You can't show it to us here.
No. Okay, you got it. Well, I'm not asking you to show them, but are there, I mean, are there situations where you would not teach certain techniques? Let's rephrase it. Are there situations where you would not teach certain techniques to certain people, either because of their age, their rank, their maturity, their ability to make a good judgment? So
in Jiu-Jitsu, it has a pattern. I think it has a pattern how you teach the techniques, because when you start with yellow belt, or what the first belt then is, then you learn the joint locks and all the soft techniques. And then when you move on, the techniques get rougher and rougher and rougher. And then when you hit black belt, then comes the dangerous strikes, and also the medical issues, how you can hit a point that is fatal at one strike that comes in black belt and level upwards. But it's also up to a practitioner nowadays, because all the information is out there. You can buy good books of everything. So even if you follow this pattern of learning techniques in this sequence, softer techniques first and then harder techniques later, then there is the literature that people can learn all the other techniques, or watch MMA from TV and learn from that nasty techniques, hitting the nose or hitting the throat or whatever. So I think it's pretty hard to control nowadays how you teach or when you teach a dangerous technique. If you have a practitioner that only goes to your gym and you learn it from the beginning, then they'll learn it the right way, and you learn how the person is also during the years, and when you get the relationship between the person, so you know how or she is, then you can learn the nasty techniques more faster, because you know the person. But when you have a total new class of new persons, then you have to start with the gentle techniques, the joint locks, and show techniques that aren't that dangerous. But I see that it's very hard to restrict nowadays how you teach what techniques to people, because all the knowledge is out there in books and on TV and whatever. So it's hard to control as a sensei by yourself.
Okay, I think, and I'm going to challenge some of your thinking here, but that's we teach, okay, Budoshin, we teach certain techniques at white belt, and you move up, and these techniques are expanded on, you learn more variations, etc. I think you can learn, or you can quote unquote practice all the techniques you want, whether they be soft, hard, etc. But until you can do them smoothly without having to think, whether you call it mushin or just practice, they're essentially going to be useless to you in a street situation. I know there are some systems of jujitsu, and you probably heard this before. They do beautiful kata. They practice on each other till hell freezes over. Okay, and they go into competitions where all they are judged on is how nicely their kata looks. But you put them in a street situation or where they're being faced with random attacks and they can't fight their way out of a paper bag. And so all that knowledge, it's like any martial art. It all depends what you're being trained for. If you're in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're trained for competition. And as Darren said, tapping out. If you're in judo, you're trained for competition. Yes, there are some self-defense factors in there. Okay, but your training determines how you will function. Okay, in anything you do. And the more training you have, theoretically, the better you get. And also theoretically, the more responsible you become in using those skills you have, martial arts or anything. Okay. So I think, the information is out there. I mean, there's information out there on how to build a nuclear bomb. I mean, it's and there are probably some people who could financially afford to get all the materials to build a nuclear bomb. But the issue comes down to, can they do it without blowing themselves to pieces in the process? Okay. So I think with the martial arts, it doesn't matter whether the technique is a hard technique or soft technique. I think as the person needs to be sufficiently skilled at the execution of that technique to make it effective on the street, they need to be put in situations where they have to respond to certain, you're attacked, how do you respond? And this takes time. And that's what, in my book, belt promotions are for. You're increasing your knowledge, you're increasing your proficiency, you're providing a good example to the other students in the class. All these other factors play into a belt promotion. Well, in my book, they should. It's not just a matter of, can you go through the motions of doing a technique? It's not just, can you do a kata? It's, can you use this? And is it working reasonably effective for you? And is your skill level in that execution improving? If a person tests for a green belt and they do it, and I ask for a hip throw, I do not expect the same quality as I would from a brown belt or a black belt in executing a hip throw. Okay. And I think we all do that. And I think that I would hope that occurs in any martial art. You're always looking for improvement, because who said it? None of us are perfect yet. Who said it? We're striving for perfection. Dane, yeah. And that should be the goal of any martial arts training, or actually anything you do in life, is you should be trying to achieve, even if it's religious values, you should be striving to achieve perfection, as long as you don't go nuts in the process.
Yeah, I agree on that you have to have a basic skill level that you understand what is in the books available.
Yeah. I mean,
that's right. You have to have a basic skill level to understand the thing.
That's what some people miss, and that's what some instructors miss, is that there's all this other, I don't want to call it luggage, but there's all this other stuff that goes along with training a martial artist. And judgment is one of the, the ability to have good judgment is one of the top things. But I don't even think in my student handbook the word good judgment is in there anywhere.
But there's also that, what do you teach to a person that has low skill level? Is it a nasty technique that he has the right to defend himself in a harsh way so he can get out of the situation? Or do you wait until he's a black belt and then just, in the end, you show the nasty technique? So there's kind of two sides of the coin, because if you aren't skilled in the beginning, then you might have to use something nasty to get out of the situation. Something easy and nasty to get out of it.
It's the word nastier is, I mean, like, I don't teach my kids to, if they're going to kick, I basically say, don't go for a front snap kick. If you're going to kick a person in the crotch, you kick up the middle, because it's going to be far more painful. It's going to be far more effective. It will end a fight, and that person, if you do it correctly, like you're playing soccer or kickball, and that's the same kick you use, that person is going to need surgery, because it's going to fracture the pelvic bone, and that will end a fight.
Yeah, that's right.
But usually they're not proficient enough to use it until they get up to maybe purple or brown. Okay. So it's the proficiency, you can teach all this stuff. Like in Katsugo, Hal Brocious would say, well, stick a finger up their nose, which is really gross, but it really works. It's not a serious injury. They're going to get a bloody nose out of it, but it hurts like, and the person is going to move. Or sometimes he has another, like, stick a finger in their ear. It's amazing how annoying that is. But you can really, instead of doing this, for Kubinagi, you can just stick a finger in their ear and do the same. It's just annoying as hell, but it'll move the person. And is it nasty or dirty? I don't know. I don't think it's nasty. It's just,
Yeah, it's a way of showing an easy way to defend yourself. That works.
But he also, there are a lot of techniques that can be taught in a way that, and again, most students won't want to use it. They don't like to stick their fingers in other people's ears.
I think that's what it comes down to there. Like because we've talked about this a little bit in the past too, because I grew up like learning all those little dirty things and stuff, and then I found them missing everywhere else, But I think what we're really doing and what we're saying, what you do teach somebody are principled techniques.
Yes.
Not techniques. You're teaching techniques that teach a principle. Like, it doesn't matter what throw, they are throws. And you could have all these variations on the hip throw where you put your arm under his arm, around his neck, and grab his belt, grab this arm, grab this arm. All of those ultimately are, you're teaching somebody to manipulate the center of gravity over a fulcrum. And they all do that. So it doesn't matter what one they learn. If they get good at it, they can just do throws, And in those throws, that's what you need to teach, is how to do throwing, right? But in that hip throw, when you do it, you might box their ears first, poke them in the eye, put your fingers in their nose, and then do the hip throw.
Right.
There's a value to the student in learning the hip throw, because now they can do hip throws. Right. You can already do this. There's no principle in that technique. It's just a variation of a principle technique. It's like doing it's like any hip throw is just a hip throw, but now it's a dirty hip throw if you poke them in the eyes on the way down, if you scratch them when you're doing it, if you're whatever. Those are things that follow from learning the principles. Then you can say, well, instead of doing this, now that I know how to do that really well, what would happen if I put my finger here? What if I do this? What if I cover his eyes while I do that? And I hold him like this and this now. And, all those things. I think that's why you don't necessarily teach them, because there's something that once you get good at the principles, you'll just think of, right? Like, I've already got this guy's wrist here. What if I press his thumb while I've got it? You don't need to teach pressing thumbs. You need to teach this because this is hard to learn. And then once you're here, you're like, what about that?
And
So
also,
I think that might be why it's not really the safety and stuff. There's just not a good lesson for a student.
Yeah, and if you have to teach self-defense to somebody that's physical weak, or a small child or something, they also ask, what if this doesn't work? And then I said, then you just break the little finger. You use all your force to break the little finger, because that will work, and you'll get out of the movement.
Right.
So
that's a huge problem. That beginner mindset that you want to replace your knowledge with like jujitsu knowledge. I want to do everything the jujitsu way. As soon as you come in, it's like, well, what do I do? What do I do? Well, what would you have done yesterday? All of that stuff is still there. You still know all of these things. You still know it hurts if you twist people's fingers and things. Like, don't forget all of those things you've learned your entire life. And then you should be adding martial arts to it. But I think a lot of people want to replace what they know and have everything come from their martial art, not have the martial art just add to what you already know. Like, what do? I don't know, slap him, scream in his face, do something, bite him, step on him. I don't know what the situation is. I can't teach you that, figure it out yourself. But they want you to tell them I should just know what to do because of my training. Like,
and
I don't
actually,
know what to tell you.
You have to teach it in the beginning, because that's the first reactions of self-defense: scratching the eyes or breaking the finger or putting the fingers in the nose, because that's a really good. It's a fast way to get out of it because making a wrist lock, the first time you do it, you probably won't succeed. You do it wrong, or you don't have the right angle or something like that. So how do you fast learn self-defense? It is poking the eyes, putting the fingers in the nose, or breaking the little finger. And also to people who are not physically strong, a woman or a child, then you have to start learning with them, with the ask, okay, this doesn't work. And okay, they poke the finger in the eye and then continue, or break the little finger, see if it hurts, and then you are out. So you have to, many times for me, in the beginning, you have to learn the atemi strikes to get more time, or to get the technique more effective.
Yeah. With newer students, I have, and I don't know when I started doing this, decades ago. It's amazing how many things we do in real life that end up being really good jujitsu techniques. And if students make that connection, they learn techniques a lot faster. For example, I'd say, okay, one of the releases we teach for a front choke. Okay. I say, when you were in kindergarten and you knew the answer to a question, how did you get the teacher's attention? Let me pick on Robert here. You were in kindergarten. You wanted to get the teacher's attention. What did you do?
I raised up my, my slate tablet and
you raise your hand. Turn sideways. Try it with your students. It is one of the easiest releases. And then you can go into other techniques like wrist lock takedown or yada, 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 which is Dane is referring to. It's and they said the light turns on. And they say, this is easy. Headlock. How do you get out of a headlock? I said, how many of you know the breaststroke in swimming? Okay, put your finger against the nose, do the breaststroke. And they get out of a headlock. And many times, yes, this is totally stupid from one perspective. But I learned a long time that sometimes if you make really stupid analogies, students get a lesson a lot faster than if you're trying to be serious. Because it's a skill they already have, and they just haven't thought of it differently. Okay, they can do the basic hip throw. So now what are the other things they can do? They can stick a finger in their ear. If you slap a person this way, you stick a finger in their ear, stick a finger up their nose, you put your finger, right up here. It's all going to turn the head the same way. And once they're getting a concept, as Dane has mentioned. Okay, and that's what you're after, because at some point they're going to start putting the concepts together, or they're going to start putting basic core jujitsu techniques together. And I've learned some really effective techniques from my students. And usually what's happened is if a student comes up with they think is a really effective technique for a particular attack, and I've even had purple belts do this. I'll say, okay, you can do this really well. Teach it to the class. And if they can teach it to the class and the class can do it, it has validity. If only they can do it, it's their personal thing, which is still fine, but it's their personal thing. And I've picked up some really good core technique combinations from my students. So keep an eye on your students, because they may surprise you sometimes. But there are. I don't worry too much about, is a technique dirty or clean or vicious or not nice, because no jiu-jitsu techniques are nice. They're all meant for self-defense.
And maybe also a wrong word to use, dirty, for a technique. It's a semi-strike, because the outcome could be worse for the one who is doing the self-defense against somebody. So calling it a dirty technique might be a wrong. It's a semi-strike to get out of a situation where you are in a threatened situation.
Right. So I think we're both saying the same thing from different perspectives or ways, because as you become more proficient at anything, you tend to put other things together and you say, oh, I can strike at his throat this way, or I can strike at his throat this way. This may not be fatal, this will be. Okay. And so they get the proficiency and they realize they can do this. Then the issue becomes, will they do this? And so there are techniques to the, how do you say it? Their execution of techniques to the person who knows absolutely nothing about jiu-jitsu, saying, God, that was a cruel thing to do. That was nasty. That was dirty. That wasn't nice. How could you do that to another person? And your perspective was, well, they attacked me, and I felt their attack was sufficient enough to give this particular response. You probably won't know exactly what you did anyway. You'll need to see it on someone else's smartphone.
And for a person, sometimes they have to do it to get out of the situation.
Yes.
That's the only way of doing the self-defense, is to use the atemi strike in a point that it hurts enough so they can get out of the situation, because they lack the knowledge of doing something else.
Right. I mean, there's one summer camp I ran several years ago where we actually taught people how to bite properly. There's a proper way to bite. And just in case you want to try this with your students, you get a bag of rolls that are about this big. Each roll is about this big. Someone else holds it, and you have the students, how big of a single bite can you make into that roll? And think like a pit bull. If you know how a pit bull bites and shakes his head around, that's how you bite another human being. You don't take little nibbles, because the human bite is a very vicious bite. It can cause a lot of damage. And no, you're not being a vampire. If you bite another person, they're going to need medical care. They're going to need, even if it's a minor bite, they're going to need to get a tetanus shot, surprisingly. Okay. That's a common medical procedure for a human bite. You give them a tetanus shot. God, I didn't know I had all those germs in my mouth.
What have you been biting?
But anyway, it was like yesterday. My daughter, or a couple of days ago, my daughter was at the LA County Fair, and a goat jumped on her and scratched her leg, and it bled, And she got home. I said, "When was the last time you had your tetanus shot?" She says, "Why?" I said, "Because a goat scratched you, and where the goats. You don't know where the goat's feet have been." And she said, "A year ago." I said, "Okay." But yeah, you do. And is biting a human a nasty, cruel, dirty thing to do? Yes. Is it socially acceptable? No. But if it's either you or them, it's going to be them, or it should be them. I mean, anyway.
There's also the physical aspect of it. If you have somebody that's physical bigger than you, or you yourself small or something like that, then I think it becomes more and more acceptable to use a rougher technique on the person, because you have to get away. So
yes, just a second here. Let me get I may have brought this up before. If you can get this book, I can show it here. Why is it being a problem?
There you go.
There we go. It's Defensive Tactics Using a Flashlight by John C. Peters Jr. Okay. Flashlight techniques are good. Hunky-dory. Okay. They use these flashlights that carry 200 D cells, but in the back, there are charts that deal with, based on your size, age, sex, etc., that justifies using higher levels of force. And many of these have been used in court. And it's a great reference book for your own use and reference. And there are some court cases in there. And so it's worthwhile to have just as a reference. And when was this published? This is an old book. 1982. But if you can find a copy, buy a copy.
One is also using your key. You always have keys with you. Keys can be good to scratch with or poke with if you have your home key or car keys.
Yeah, I gave up on poking the eyes out or poking them with keys years ago. I found people won't do it because you're going to blind the person. All these value judgments come in. What does work, and you also said it, is scratching across with your fingers or your keys. If you've ever had your eyeball scratched, I mean, I did it about 6 weeks ago when I was pruning some bushes out in the backyard. Branch came across. I mean, I couldn't open my eyes for about half a minute or so. It just hurt too much. Now, one of the nice things about the human body is the eyes are the fastest healing organ in the human body. Okay. I did later in the day go to eyes are urgent care because, you know, the eyes were still watering, et cetera. And I did, you know, want to make sure there's nothing serious going wrong. But scratching, people will do. They have no hesitation.
I got my daughter's nail in the eye when she was very little, and I was out for 2 weeks with a patch on my eye.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, and no, scratching a person across. See, somehow scratching a person across the eyes is socially acceptable. Poking their eyes out is not. And,
yeah.
And so sometimes you know, as a martial artist, if we're teaching, we have to accept some of these social mores, for lack of a better phrase, because with a lot of the things we do, you know, we break a person's wrist, you dislocate their shoulder, you break their rib or something like that, you know, those will heal up. And that makes it, quote unquote, socially acceptable. However, poking a person's eyes out, they're blind for the rest of their life. Assuming
the eye is very, 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 very bad because you cannot do anything because you are concentrating on the eye the whole time. So you're totally out if you scratch the eye.
Or if a person attacks you with a knife and you take their knife away and you stab them with intent. Okay, that's a permanent effect, and we're not into, because of the society, we're not living in ancient Japan, where if you're samurai and someone attacks you and you accidentally cut their head off, nothing's going to happen to you theoretically. You know, we can't do those sorts of things.
You know, that's a good point that I was just kind of thinking about right when you said it, because I was poking fun at karate a little bit, where, you know, somebody grabs your wrist and your response is you break their knee and, you know, collapse their windpipe and box their ears and do all of these really ridiculous responses to that. And you think about it like, why was somebody trying to grab my wrist? Why did I have such a reaction, you know, and all of that. And sometimes I think we're learning historical things in a modern context and lose that context because you think it's a wrist grab. But if you think about it, what if they're grabbing the handle of your sword, not your wrist? You know, if you're wearing a sword at your hip and you have your hand on your sword, on your, you know, your left hand's on your sword, you're about to pull it up. Now somebody grabbed that wrist. Now it's not a wrist grab like you're in the mall and you're getting abducted, you know, at the store here. That's a real wrist grab because it's stopping your sword from being drawn. And then at the end of that, when you're using a knife hand, you're actually drawing your short knife, you know, to do these things. So then we learn that abstracted and pulled into, like, that's now a self-defense technique. Somebody grabs your wrist, you kick them in the knee and blah, blah, blah. But we've lost they grabbed your wrist so you can't grab your sword. And so you know, that kind of thing is missing.
I think the attack, I'm sorry, the attack has to be, by the attacker, has to be put in a context. If Darren grabs your wrist, you can't haul off and do those things and get away with it if all Darren has done has been to grab your wrist. On the other hand, if you grab a 12-year-old girl's wrist and try and pull her, even in a mall, and she does all those things, what she did was socially acceptable.
Right. Yeah, that's why they make fun of it and say it's become children's karate.
Right.
Like that kind of thing. Exactly. Like the mall abduction scenario is like when you could do that samurai technique now, but like to an adult man, who's ever going to just grab you by the wrist like that, right? But because they would have done it if you had a sword 300 years ago. That's why we're learning it as an adult male response, But now it's useful. Yes, definitely. It's useful still for those kinds of scenarios, definitely.
Yeah.
But
and if you push
that context is important.
Mushin into the aspect also that you train the technique so you do it automatically, everything. So it's ancient, dangerous techniques that you have inside yourself. I have also once in a bar, somebody tried to hit me, took the shoulder, hit me, and I also had to throw him. It totally came automatically out of Mushin. I didn't think about it. I just did it because the hit was on its way towards my head. So you don't have time to think anymore. So the way you train is the way you act.
Yeah. One of my black belts, he's really good at verbal judo. And some of his responses to situations are just, they crack you up, but they really make a point and get up people. One of his best has been, he says, if you're in a mall, for example, and you're confronted by 2 or 3 people, and you have your son or daughter by your side, and if what you do is you simply, this person's trying to intimidate you, and you turn to one of them and say, because no one's really paying that close of attention, you say, "Get your hands off my son, you pervert." The word pervert gets everybody's attention. Okay. And also what happens is the person that's with the pervert has a tendency to step away from his friend because he doesn't want to be referred to as the pervert. So sometimes it's, your response to a physical, if a person grabs you, you make some sort of verbal response that really, you're not as much concerned about how they react, but you're getting everybody else's attention because of a word that you used in your response to them. And he's really good at that. And I'll see if Darren, you might know Michael.
Yes.
He's he comes off with really, and that's one reason I like him so much, is he comes back with really off the wall responses to situations that I wouldn't even think of. And it's just a unique skill he has. And it's just, certain words will get everybody's attention. I mean, if a person grabs your shoulder and you say, "Oh, you want to have sex with me?" That's going to get everybody's attention. And that's if you're using verbal skill, that's one thing that you want to be able to do, is get everybody's attention. Now, this guy may simply let go because he's worried about what kind of a person you are. But that's not relevant to you. Your intent is to get out of that situation.
Well, the other thing I would think about that is, they think about a lot, like in a sports event in basketball, where there starts to be like an altercation. It isn't the first guy that makes contact; it's the guy who reacts who gets blamed. So, but inserting that verbal command, you haven't taken any physical action, and you're calling attention to the physical action he took.
Yes.
Just in terms of establishing who is being the aggressor.
Yes. Beautiful, Charles. Yeah. Because that will be what people remember. And that's, Anyway, so, well, we got through everything else we need to talk to, a number of martial arts techniques. So I guess we're back to the same question is, are there any, I guess, are there any situations where you've been in where you've refused to teach certain techniques to certain students?
Yeah.
No one else is going to answer except Robert. He raised his hand. He got out of a chokehold. Yeah.
Well, and two, is it
I wouldn't teach that.
Is it not teaching them, or like is it refusing to teach them, or is it just you just don't teach them because that's something they should learn on their own, right?
It would be, I would say, refusing to teach them because you're afraid they might, and that brings up a greater issue. You're concerned about their good judgment.
I think you shouldn't have that person as a student.
Yeah,
exactly. Yes,
exactly.
Good. I'm glad you responded that way.
That's right.
That's the answer. Okay.
Don't bring them in.
Yeah, they shouldn't be in the dojo in the first place. And there have been times when I have, because of the way a student has, it's only happened 2 or 3 times, fortunately. There have been times when I have told a student or the parent, I cannot have the student in my class. They're not using good judgment. I'm afraid they're going to get hurt or they're going to hurt somebody else. And I can't afford that risk to myself or my students.
Exactly.
And that's a hard pill to swallow to some students and parents. I had one guy who was in his maybe mid-20s who came into class. He had signed up for the class. He was crossing stuff out on the release that he didn't agree to, which was a good first signal. And the second signal, when I picked up with his leather jacket, it was kind of heavy on one side. There was a roll of quarters in one of his pockets. And that was my final judgment. That was my final. Yeah, I was just going to tell him, you either have to sign the agreement as it is or get a refund from the city. And I stuck with that argument. I didn't mention the roll of quarters in his pocket. But I was really, I said, well, you either sign that release or go to the city and get your money back. And that's what he did. But I was still debating at the time, do I call up the sheriff's office and say, here's this guy who's got this potential brass knuckles in his jacket. And I decided not to, but it was a tough call on my part. Because I've had experience with that, and I'm not, and you don't mess with people like that. And he left. One other thing is, and then I think we're going to end here. One thing you want to have in your dojo, because a long time ago I had a drunk walk into class one night, and he wanted to fight someone, which it was obvious he was drunk. And so we talked for a while, but I had also, and there was no phone in the building we were in, which that's irrelevant now since everybody in their pet rat has a cell phone. But we had a code, which was this. And one of the black belts left, went up to another building, called the police. And during this time, I was just, I just spent the time talking with the guy. And they came and took him away. So, you need to, for your own CYA and your students' protection, because, there may be people that come into your dojo on rare occasion and create a inappropriate situation for your students or yourself. You need to have some sort of simple code where one of your black belts or assistant instructors will, leave and call the police, because this is not something you want to have to handle on your own, unless they get physical. But the best, that provides a good example for your students too. So it's just, a word to the wise. This kind of goes along the same sides of having students in your, if a student comes to your class and they've had too much to drink, or they're on something, you don't have them participate. And if they're a student and you know them, you can say, you've had too much, I think you've had too much to drink, or you toked one too many joints, or if you're not familiar with the terminology, I'll explain it to you later. Call me. You can if it's a student you can be upfront and say, is there someone who can drive you home? Would you like to? Do you like someone here to drive you home? Only an adult will drive you home. But you have to do this to protect your class, and that's your primary responsibility. So, and that goes along with the student who shouldn't be taught techniques. Anyhow, next time we will get into martial artists or any interest as an information collector. I know a couple martial artists that you go into their basements. It's a virtual library of martial arts books, hundreds, if not hundreds of books. And they just collect them. But anyway, that's another issue. Copyright laws coming back after COVID. Okay. And anyway, so there are some other good topics. If you have some other topics for the future, please get them to me. I don't want to run out. And anyway, so I think that's about it for today, unless we've been here for almost 2 hours now. Too much time. No, I shouldn't do that. Anyhow, have a good weekend. Our next meeting will be on June 10 and 24th. And that's because the previous weekend is close to our wedding anniversary, and I don't know what we may have planned or something like that. And so I don't want to have to cancel out on you guys at the last moment. Say sorry. So,
how many years?
We got married in 76. This will be
47. Is it 47 years? Yeah. 47 years. Wow.
congratulations. Is it 47 years?
Congratulations.
Yeah, I'm getting up there. I have to do something on the 50th. Anyway.
They're planning now.
Anyway. So yeah, it's been fun. So anyhow, I want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank Charles and Ernie for joining us today, and hope you'll be back next time. And have a great weekend. I hope wherever you're at, the weather is decent. And that's about it.
Thank you.
And Joni, how warm? What is it? Temperature wise there today?
It was 20. We have our first summer week in Finland, so it's 20 degrees Celsius. So
can anybody convert that to Fahrenheit?
Are you
I
kidding?
don't know
Yes.
what
It's about 70,
like 72 or something.
Yeah.
it's nice summer weather in Finland, but
72.
Yeah. You just double it and add 32, roughly.
Okay.
Yeah. So 72 is on the nose. That's nice. Nice weather.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. That's a nice. Yeah. I wish it was that cool here.
Yeah. We are enjoying the summer without t-shirts on.
Yeah. Okay. Take care, everyone. Be good.
Thanks for the conversion, Ernest. I'm
a nerd. I'm a nerd.
I need to use that.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Someone has their head screwed on tight. Right.
All right. Take care. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.